September 1st, 1939. German troops advanced deep into Poland to complete a rapid and decisive victory. Fewer than 20 years earlier, their ancestors had marched as well, but back into their own nation as a defeated army. In November of 1918, for years into World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, had been compelled to relinquish the throne. His armies were being depleted day after day by relentless counterattack by British, French, and American forces. His citizens were starving, but already a pernicious myth was on the rise. German soldiers and commanders claimed that they were not defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by their own treacherous politicians. Nevertheless, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, at 11 a.m. on November the 11th, 1918, World War I came to an end. The following month, United States President Woodrow Wilson traveled to Europe with the goal of creating a new world order. World leaders were persuaded by him to form a new League of Nations. In the Treaty of Versailles, they signed that from that point forward, wars between nations would no longer be resolved by war, but by negotiation in the League. The European nations were freed. Germany's partner, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was broken up. New nations were established from it: Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was greatly reduced in size. But this process contained a time bomb. Not everyone welcomed the entry of nations, such as Czechoslovakia. They had large German minorities. Someday, the urge to reunite the Germans would return to haunt Europe. German nation also suffered one last humiliation. They had to pay a staggering £6.6 billion in reparations to Britain and France, which they could hardly afford. And when Wilson returned to America, his new world order fell apart almost overnight. The U.S. Congress concluded that it could not afford to become involved in another war in Europe. It would not be a part of his league, and the U.S. returned to isolationism. Germany was very different now. It was still the largest country in Europe, but its militaristic monarchicalism was over. It was a democracy now. But its government, the Weimar Republic that it was known as, was soon afterwards struck by a series of hammer blows. There were street battles between communists attempting to create a revolution and right-wing nationalists. And then in 1923 the nation went through hyperinflation, hundreds of % a month. Savings were wiped out. This was rich ground for a new generation of right-wing rabble-rousing politicians, Adolf Hitler included. Hitler was born in Austria. He had fought as a soldier in the First World War and been awarded the Iron Cross. Back in Germany, he went to live in Munich, and his fiery speeches soon enabled him to dominate the tiny National Socialist, or Nazi Party. Hitler and his party attempted a forceful rebellion against the Weimar government in October 1923. It was a failure, and he was given a sentence of 9 months. While in prison, he composed a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he attributed the ills of Germany to the Jews and called for it to rebuild its power and look for new lands in the East. When he was released, he embarked on creating the Nazis into a proper, disciplined political party. After this, he would employ the democratic path to assume power. Weimar Germany flourished for the remaining 5 years, however. Extremist right and left-wing parties became unpopular. Then Hitler's time had arrived. The American stock market collapsed in October 1929. Billions of dollars were lost, and the world was swept into a depression. Unemployment in Germany had climbed to over 6 million. Radical politicians seemed to be the only ones who had a solution. We have chosen one objective, and it was the best of the Nazi retreat. Politicians like Hitler. His Nazis, by 1931, were a real mass movement. And they had their own brown shirt thugs, the SA storm troops, numbering almost 3 million. The Nazis became the majority party in the German parliament, the Reichstag, in the 1932 elections. However, Hitler would not accept a coalition, and parliament remained in a state of paralysis. President Hindenburg ended the stalemate and appointed him as chancellor in January 1933, the head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag was burned down. Hitler blamed the communists and requested emergency powers. He subsequently used them to ban all other political parties. President Hindenburg passed away in August 1934. Hitler declared himself president. He was now absolute ruler, Germany's Führer. There was no clue at first as to what was in store. The following 3 years, the Führer concentrated on putting Germany's economy back on its feet. Millions were invested in public works, like the 5,000-mile Autobahn system, to put the unemployed to work. But secretly, Hitler was also pursuing a massive rearmament scheme of his own. The German army, under the Versailles Treaty, had been restricted to 100,000 soldiers. The nation was not allowed to have an air force, tanks, or submarines. This small army was trebled in size. Then, in 1935, Hitler came out into the open. He unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. It possessed a 2,500 airplane air force, much bigger than Britain's or France's. Unemployment fell, and the Nazis were extremely popular. The Führer was confident now and took his first step towards expansion. In 1935, he regained the Saarland area along the border with France, after a plebiscite to secede from League of Nations control and return to Germany. He sent German troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone of Germany under Versailles, a year later. Most people at the time thought Hitler was simply reclaiming what was rightfully Germany's. Neither Britain nor France complained. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazis appeared to most people stern but fair. A government that restored the pride of the nation and threatened no one. Yes, there were signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws excluded Jews from marrying true Aryan Germans and stripped them of their citizenship. But when these initial threats to international peace were issued, they did not come from Hitler at all, but from somewhere else. Japan, at the start of the 20th century, was already a military power. It had defeated Russia in war in 1905 and had fought alongside the Allies in World War I. Post-war Japan was an accepted world power, and it was a member of the League of Nations. Politically, though, it was a whirlpool of contradictions. Technically a democracy, feudal tradition continued. Most Japanese revered their emperor as a living god and regarded him as their actual ruler. And the country had severe economic problems. Its population was booming, and it had no natural resources to fuel its rapidly growing industries. Its leaders were in a quandary, and they looked to Chinese Manchuria for solutions. Manchuria was a land of rich grain fields, rich in minerals and coal. It was a prime target. It was already held by Japanese troops. The other likely objectives were the British-held European-owned colonies of Hong Kong, Malaya, and Burma, French-held Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. But Japan had to exercise caution here. They did not wish to awaken the other Pacific great power, the United States. For all its anti-imperialist rhetoric, the US in fact possessed an unofficial empire in the Pacific. It occupied the Philippines, Guam, and a chain of islands outright. It certainly had the power to defy Japan, but since the conclusion of World War I it had had other priorities. This was the age of jazz in America. America focused on developing its extensive resources in the 1920s. It was an economic boom that did not appear to stop. Wealth was built in industry and on the stock exchanges. America was lost to increasing pursuit of pleasure. With these diversions, Japan's increasing pains in the Pacific had seemed distant. America had cut down its military after World War I and signed a naval reduction agreement with Britain, France, and Japan. It effectively lost naval dominance in the Pacific to Japan. The Great Depression ensued. As economic ruin rolled in, a quarter of the population found themselves out of work. Homeless people in the tens of thousands lived in shantytowns. What was once a land where leisure was the ultimate priority now centered on suffering. It was now the turn of Japan. In 1931, without even consulting their own democratically elected government, the Japanese army in Manchuria seized the capital, Mukden, and then occupied the rest of the territory. A puppet regime, Manchukuo, was proclaimed under a puppet emperor. Chinese former Emperor Henry Puyi, deposed in 1911, was recalled from retirement in this installment. Uncover the past with original military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts hosted by world-leading historians. All on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go on your mobile. Download the app now and stream them all, from the riveting story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Be taken back by the riveting stories of this amazing period by subscribing through the link in the description. At Geneva, the seat of the League of Nations, she was to encounter her very first great test. Japan was condemned by all, but her response was straightforward. Japan cannot, however, accept the report submitted by the Assembly. The Japanese simply walked out, and the League discovered that it had no means of preventing Manchuria. Japan became an international outcast, but it did not care. Their leaders had shifted their attention to further conquests in China. These were bountiful pickings. China was in chaos. The Chiang Kai-shek regime was involved in a struggle with the Mao Zedong Chinese Communist Party. There was strife at the heart of the country. The Japanese, in preparation for invasion, allied with Hitler in 1936. The goal was to defend against any Soviet-Russian invasion if it were to march on China. Then, in July 1937, the Japanese made a pretext with Chinese troops and invaded. The Chinese were initially taken by surprise, but they soon fought back with tremendous ferocity, the Communists even joining the Kuomintang in a united front. The Japanese responded with amphibious attacks. By late 1937, they had overrun most of northern China and the coast. The Japanese conducted this war in their typical brutality, bombing cities indiscriminately. Westerners living in the business hub, the port city of Shanghai, had been evacuated by now. The city was then under siege for 3 months. It was looted en masse, the Japanese soldiers being devoid of sympathy and compassion for the native population. But it was only after the fall of Nanking, which was then Chinese capital, on December 17, 1937, that the Japanese soldiers rampaged. More than 300,000 civilians are believed to have been killed in a 6-week rampage of rape and random killing. Even the Japanese bombed British and American warships that had been sent to protect their shipping and trade. The most disastrous incident happened on December 12, 1937. The Panay, an American gunboat, had been sunk by Japanese bombers. 50 sailors were killed. The Western powers, however, were not willing to step in, so the League of Nations could not do anything. In America, President Roosevelt wished to impose a naval blockade on Japan. It has been realized by us that the policies and actions of other nations in other regions of the world have huge implications for us. But the British would not accept this, as they were afraid that it would lead to a war. All Roosevelt could provide thus was a loan of $25 million to Chiang Kai-shek to purchase arms. Although the Communists were now allied with the Kuomintang, even the Soviet Union did nothing to assist either. Its only effort was a series of border battles along its own border with Manchuria. But China itself did not gain. Instead, it was compelled to fend for itself. Canton fell to the Japanese in 1938 and pushed the Chinese further into the western region of the country. It had all been so much hollow League of Nations talk, all those promises of eradicating international aggression. And already the Western powers had to face aggression closer to home. Now we can laugh at Benito Mussolini, the fascist ruler of Italy. All that strutting seems faintly ridiculous nowadays. But in 1922, it did not. In those years, Italy had seemed to be on the verge of anarchy. The nation was divided by land seizures and strikes. The democratic government, as in Germany, was unable to do anything to oppose such anarchy. Therefore, a war veteran and a journalist, Benito Mussolini, decided to intervene. He created a right-wing nationalist political party, the Fascists. When the country was paralyzed by a general strike in August 1922, Mussolini told his followers to march on Rome. Italy's king, Victor Emmanuel, out of fear of a civil war, invited him to create a government. Mussolini quickly defeated all political resistance and took dictatorial powers. By 1928, his grip was absolute. Parliament was appointed, not elected, and the fascist Grand Council had all the power. As was the case with Hitler, his early actions made Mussolini extremely popular. Gigantic public works created jobs and transformed the infrastructure of Italy. Corruption was eradicated and the mafia was all but destroyed. Italy's military was created, with a cutting-edge advanced air force. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini had a powerful navy, greater than the combined British and French Mediterranean fleet. When the Great Depression subsequently arrived, Italy seemed to ride it out even more successfully than the majority. Mussolini was a source of global inspiration. Political leaders, far from anyone, Adolf Hitler included in Germany, regarded the fascist regime as an example, firm and resolute compared with the weaknesses of the democracies in Britain and France. But Mussolini sought more than admiration. He wanted to restore the Roman Empire, and already he had found a target for his first imperial land grab. Abyssinia, today Ethiopia, was his target. There were already Italian border colonies in Eritrea and Italian Somalia. In December 1934, Italian forces instigated a skirmish against Abyssinian troops at an oasis inside Ogaden district, far within Abyssinian borders. Mussolini then dispatched troops to Italian Somalia and Eritrea and demanded compensation from Abyssinia. The Abyssinian emperor, Haile Selassie, even came in person to the League of Nations and appealed to them. He appealed to it to be true to its ideals. Here was a small country in danger from one of the League members. This was the ultimate test. But the League did nothing. The British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, at least made an effort to negotiate a peace treaty, but Mussolini would not hear of it. In early October 1935, the Italian army marched in from Italian Somalia and Eritrea. The old Abyssinian forces had little hope against a contemporary army with tanks and artillery. The Italian Air Force dominated the skies and harassed the Abyssinians at every turn, periodically employing gas bombs. Although gas had been banned at Versailles, was a war crime against humanity. 6 months after these words were spoken, Abyssinia was invaded. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. The League of Nations wrung its hands from its Swiss headquarters. It did employ economic sanctions, but to no effect. Mussolini's aggression had proven two things. The League of Nations, that great hope for peace, had no power. And neither of Europe's would-be great powers, the democracies Britain and France, wanted to fight. France and Britain had both been decimated by World War I, and their economies never really recovered. Both had experienced waves of strikes and unrest. Both had faced mass unemployment, even before the Great Depression. Both had also paid the cost of upholding empires, now augmented by the conquest of Germany's old colonies and the Middle Eastern territories once ruled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And above all, both had been stunned by the horrific losses of World War I. Successive British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and above all, Stanley Baldwin, all resolved to keep Britain out of any future wars. Despite horrific losses on the Western Front, Britain emerged from World War I with a huge, highly effective conscript army. This was demobilized straight away to a very small professional army to maintain its huge empire. And then, when the Great Depression struck, any intentions of modernizing the army were put on the back burner. It meant that Britain entered the pre-war period economically and militarily weak. French losses in World War I had been even greater than the British. Always suspicious of the Germans, a large conscript army was kept on. But in the 1920s, France's birth rate had fallen. It was clear that by the mid to late 1930s, there would be a manpower shortage. France recognized that it would never be able to match the Germans in terms of sheer numbers of troops. The response was to go into a purely defensive mode. The Maginot Line, a series of fortifications, was begun in 1930 along the German border and was extended as far as the Belgian border. It there theoretically connected with fortifications that the Belgians had intended. This new French war strategy was one under which France could only fight a defensive war. It just did not happen. This document takes more than 30 minutes. Go unlimited at turbocrb.ai to transcribe files up to 10 hours.